When we think of corruption, we imagine foreign dictators, crooked politicians, or shady billionaires. But here's the shocking truth. Some of the most corrupt men in American history sat right inside the Oval Office. They weren't outsiders. They were presidents. Men who swore to protect the nation, yet secretly abused power, cut backroom deals, and left scandals so deep, the country is still paying the price today. In this video, we're counting down the top 5 most corrupt U.S. presidents. And trust me, you'll be stunned by who made the list and why. 5. Warren G. Harding, the president who let his friends loot the country. When Warren G. Harding became president in 1921, Americans hoped for calm after the chaos of World War I. Harding looked the part. Tall, handsome, and friendly, he promised a return to normalcy. People wanted peace, stability, and someone who seemed trustworthy. But instead of calm, Harding's presidency became one of the most scandal-filled chapters in U.S. history. Historians often say Harding wasn't personally evil or greedy. In fact, he was known to be generous and easygoing. His downfall came from weakness. He simply trusted the wrong people. Harding surrounded himself with old friends from Ohio, men quickly nicknamed the Ohio Gang. These men treated government power like a jackpot, handing out favors, deals, and contracts to enrich themselves. The biggest scandal of all was the Teapot Dome affair. Harding's Secretary of the Interior, Albert Fall, secretly leased Navy oil reserves to private companies without competitive bidding. In return, he pocketed bribes worth more than $400,000, over $6 million today. For the first time in U.S. history, a cabinet official went to prison. Harding himself didn't take the money, but his failure to control his inner circle ruined him. When he suddenly died in 1923 during a trip to California, rumors spread that his wife had poisoned him to prevent more embarrassment. There's no proof, but it shows how poisoned his legacy had become. Harding's story is a cautionary tale. Sometimes the greatest danger isn't the president's own greed, but the corrupt friends he allows to whisper in his ear. 4. Ulysses S. Grant, the hero general who couldn't control corruption. Ulysses S. Grant was celebrated as the Union's great general, the man who defeated the Confederacy and preserved the United States during its darkest hour. When he entered the White House in 1869, many Americans saw him as a symbol of honesty and strength, the kind of leader who could heal the wounds of the Civil War. But while Grant won victories on the battlefield, his presidency became a different story, a story of corruption and scandal. To be clear, Grant himself was personally honest. He despised corruption and never sought to enrich himself. But his greatest flaw was blind loyalty. Grant trusted his friends and associates too much, even when they proved unworthy of that trust. This weakness allowed a wave of corruption to wash over his administration. The most infamous example was the whiskey ring in 1875. Government officials and distillers joined forces to cheat the Treasury out of liquor taxes, stealing millions of dollars. Shockingly, Grant's own private secretary was caught up in the conspiracy. Earlier, the Crédit Mobilier scandal exposed congressmen and officials secretly profiting from fraudulent railroad construction contracts. And then came the Indian Ring, where Secretary of War William Belknap accepted bribes for lucrative trade deals with Native American tribes. Though Grant never took part in these crimes, his inability to rein in corruption destroyed the public's trust in his leadership. Even so, he remained personally admired for his wartime heroism and later for his powerful memoirs. But history leaves us with a sobering truth. Even the most heroic leader can preside over one of the most corrupt administrations in American history. 3. Richard Nixon, the president who tried to cover it all up. No list of corrupt U.S. presidents is complete without Richard Nixon. His rise to power came during one of the most turbulent periods in American history. The Vietnam War dragged on with no end in sight, the Cold War kept tensions high, and protests filled the streets. Nixon positioned himself as a tough, experienced leader who could restore order. But behind that image lay a deep suspicion, an obsession with enemies both real and imagined. And it was that paranoia that ultimately destroyed him. The breaking point came with the scandal now known simply as Watergate. In June 1972, 5 burglars were caught breaking into the Democratic National Committee headquarters inside the Watergate office complex in Washington, D.C. These weren't ordinary criminals. They were directly linked to Nixon's re-election campaign, known as the Committee to Re-elect the President, mockingly called CREEP. Instead of coming clean, Nixon and his aides orchestrated a massive cover-up. They approved hush money payments, pressured investigators, and even tried to use the CIA to block the FBI from digging deeper. For a while, it seemed like they might get away with it. But then came the smoking gun: Nixon's own secret White House tape recordings. On those tapes, the president could be heard plotting to obstruct justice. Once the tapes became public, his political support collapsed. Facing near-certain impeachment, Nixon chose to resign in August 1974, the first U.S. president ever to do so. Watergate wasn't about greed or bribes, it was about power, secrecy, and abuse of authority. Nixon once declared, "I am not a crook." But history remembers him very differently. His downfall left behind a wound in American politics, a deep, lasting mistrust of government that still lingers today. 2. Andrew Jackson, the president who turned power into personal favor. Andrew Jackson is often remembered as the People's President, a self-made war hero who claimed to stand against the elites and fight for ordinary Americans. He was tough, fiery, and deeply popular, especially among the working class. But behind this image of a democratic champion, Jackson's presidency was filled with corruption, favoritism, and the abuse of executive power. One of his most controversial legacies was the spoils system. Instead of appointing skilled administrators based on ability, Jackson rewarded government jobs to loyal supporters and political allies. Many of these men had little to no qualifications, and their incompetence often led to corruption. This system, which he defended as rotation in office, ended up weakening government institutions and setting a dangerous precedent for future politics. Jackson also waged war against the Bank of the United States. He claimed it was a tool for the wealthy elite, but in dismantling it, he funneled federal funds into smaller, pet banks controlled by his allies. These banks quickly engaged in reckless lending, which eventually led to a financial panic and economic hardship across the country. His critics accused him of ruling more like a monarch than a president. Political cartoons of the time even labeled him King Andrew I. And then there was the Trail of Tears, the forced removal of Native American tribes from their ancestral lands. While Jackson justified it as policy, the reality is that his decisions enriched land speculators and businessmen close to his administration. For many historians, Jackson's corruption wasn't about money in his own pocket. It was about loyalty, power, and bending the rules for personal and political gain. 1. James Buchanan, the president who let corruption tear a nation apart. James Buchanan is often ranked as one of the worst presidents in U.S. history. His failures weren't just about poor leadership, they were about corruption, weakness, and decisions that pushed the nation closer to the Civil War. Buchanan believed in a limited federal government, claiming Washington should not interfere in state affairs. But this hands-off approach came at the worst possible time, as the country was bitterly divided over slavery. Instead of showing strength, Buchanan's leadership left the nation vulnerable, and corruption filled the vacuum. One of the darkest moments of his presidency was his interference in the Dred Scott decision. This Supreme Court ruling declared that African Americans could never be citizens. Buchanan secretly pressured justices to rule in favor of slavery, hoping it would settle the issue once and for all. Instead, it only deepened divisions and exposed how corruptly politics and the courts were entangled. Meanwhile, Buchanan's administration was riddled with shady financial dealings, land schemes, bribes, and government contracts handed out to cronies. His government was less about serving the people and more about rewarding allies. But Buchanan's greatest failure was political corruption. He openly sided with powerful Southern slaveholders while ignoring the outrage in the North. Rather than uniting the nation, he fed the flames of division. By the time he left office in 1861, 7 Southern states had already seceded. Buchanan's corruption wasn't measured in stolen money. It was measured in lives. His choices paved the road to the bloodiest conflict in American history, the Civil War. Corruption in the White House has worn many faces: greed, blind loyalty, political favoritism, and even betrayal. From Harding's careless friends to Nixon's cover-ups, from Jackson's spoils to Buchanan's failures, each left scars that changed the course of America. The truth is timeless. When integrity dies in leadership, the whole nation suffers. Now it's your turn. Do you agree with this list, or do you think another president deserves a place among the most corrupt? Let me know in the comments. I'd love to hear your thoughts. And if this video opened your eyes, don't forget to like, subscribe, and tap the notification bell so you won't miss more untold stories of history and power.